And Arc 3 to me starts with news that after heist, a new public order decree has been issued by the authorities, and any sympathy towards partisans will trigger a permanent revocation of imperial tolerance.
Said in this accent specifically.
Yes. And then also we immediately see Luthen and Mothma talking about this. Mothma is objecting to the robbery, and
she's horrified. She didn't know anything about it.
yes. And Luthen answers, has anyone ever built a weapon that wasn't used?
Wow.
Which I think also kind of corresponds with that lieutenant in the corporate police
Right.
that was talking about weapons and being used.
Yeah.
And he's like, what did you think we were going to do? Mothma is very afraid of Palpatine's reaction. Luthen says it's exactly what they need for the Empire to overreact, as it's better than the frog slowly being boiled without noticing. So now rebels want to find and kill Andor because to them he's a loose end, because he knows Luthen and he knows too much about what they are doing.
Yeah. And like about the robbery specifically, there are direct historical parallels that we can draw between what they did and Aldhani and how real revolutions being financed. How do people need to get resources and money and whatever back in the day? And I'm remembering specifically about one of the biggest heists in the history of the Russian Empire.
This is the course of How to Finance Your Rebellion, Part 1.
Not legal advice. Not legal or financial advice. But no, it's a very interesting historical sort of incident. In 1907, there was a huge, one of the biggest heists in the history of Russian Empire. It was conducted in what is now modern Tbilisi, Georgia. I think the old name of the city was Tiflis. And in 1907, a group of left-leaning socialists, communists, revolutionaries organized this illegal operation of obtaining just an enormous sum of money. We were talking a heist very much unlike Aldhani, actually, because Aldhani was about like a backwater garrison, right? Here, everything happened essentially downtown, Central Square.
Wow.
There were a lot more casualties there. It was organized by the illegal wing of the Socialist Democratic Party back in the day. A lot of sources tend to cite that both Lenin and Stalin at their time had a direct sort of hand in organizing this whole thing, which wasn't necessarily the case. It was like a bit broader. There was the main character of this whole thing is Simon Ter-Petrosyan, Georgian revolutionary, who had the nickname also known as Kamo. And it was funny to read his biography while preparing for this episode because it very much parallels Andor's antics in a lot of ways. We're going to talk about imprisonment and all that. It's coming. But also, it's interesting the relationship to these robberies, which were called expropriations. Expropriations because from the revolutionary standpoint, they are being oppressed and it's not a robbery. We're just taking back what's ours, essentially. And it's interesting how this wasn't actually a really common practice of obtaining resources for several different reasons. One of them is that you're essentially starting to work as a sort of robbery gang almost, which comes with a lot of disorganization, potentially, right? The criminal status, the super open illegality of this whole thing, which complicates matter a lot. Like, how are you going to communicate with these people who are in this part who are doing the expropriation? And also, what are you going to do with the money, right? The large sum of money, apparently, from several different sources, I noticed that the money, they needed to be laundered even back then because already there were like serial numbers on
Tracking them.
Yeah, I mean, they could be tracked potentially, so you had to launder them somehow. You had to move them across the border. It's a lot, like physically, it's also a lot of space it takes. Yeah, there are complications, and in a lot of ways, the resources from these expropriations were not particularly utilized really well in situations like this. Yeah, you have all this money, you're sitting on a pile of dough, but like, what are you going to do with this? You have to do this whole illegal operation in order to launder them, in order to transport them. And a lot of times the logistics of it were a nightmare in and of itself. So I read Lenin's impressions of expropriations specifically, and also partisan guerrilla activity in general. Expropriations are part of the general partisan illegal sort of front of battle with oppression, but they're quite a rare case ultimately. They're much more like armed resistance tend to be much more active without the goal of needing to rob something.
It's good if you have arms.
That's the thing, right? You have to get armaments somehow, but you have to get them both for the robbery, but also for just an armed resistance if there's like a fascist uptick in a certain region. So it creates all these complications, and it's not very clear cut. And it also creates reaction from the empire,
For sure.
whether it's a Russian empire or it's a Galactic Empire, right? It creates this resistance, and Luthen specifically welcomes it because he wants the situation to reach the boiling point, after which the general population won't be able to not resist ultimately. Like, it's going to be so insufferable that you have to do something to get out of this situation. And the thing is, where they're at in Andor, they're not really there. And so he's doing all that. Yeah, he wants to get money, but also to finance all of these things, but also to provoke the Empire as much as possible. And it's not always useful. The bourgeois revolution of 1905 happened in Russia. It was a archaic feudal society for so long. And the boiling point happened sort of on the Bloody Sunday, when the demonstration was brutally massacred by the Tsarists' people. And then afterwards, there was plenty of tension also within the empire. So like the added tension from these robberies, etc., wasn't really that beneficial to the movement in general. But again, I don't want to cast specific judgments here. I'm just trying to say that, like with Aldani specifically, there are downsides and upsides to these actions, to these operations, like this robbery.
I think it's a great point to talk about also social revolutionaries. I think that was the name of the party, which was condemned by the rest of the socialists in Russian Empire, at least. So social revolutionaries were, in a nutshell, driven by the idea that if we don't know what is going to lead to a better future, we need to take as much of these bastards out as humanly possible. And so that's why they were very prone to terrorist acts. And I'm very grateful that Andor, as a TV show, did not go that way for a pretty long time until the end of Arc 3, which we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a very good connection to how Andor's stepdad died, since you mentioned it in one of the previous episodes.
The Ferrix, the home planet, was started to get occupied by the Republic, and like the presence was much more felt. And yeah, there was like some disciplinary actions were being held, and like there were a couple of people that just threw, I don't know, rocks at folks. This was like a firing squad execution on the spot because he threw a couple of rocks. This was like insane.
I think one of the main points of criticism to this movement in Russian Empire.
You mean socialist revolutionaries, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Was that it's useless in the long run because it creates so much unnecessary pressure and attention from the empire that you'd rather use this for a better cause, a much more organized way, than just to create terror and fear and lead to other party members to just being jailed because they're guilty by association.
Because we mentioned these various different types of resistance and what makes and doesn't make sense in each particular situation. And I would really love to talk about Saw Guerrera at some point, especially when we're going to see his whole arc throughout the 2 seasons and when he ends up in Rogue One.
Yep.
I really love his portrayal there.
But back to the money question, we see that Maud Ma calls in her childhood friend Tay Kolma, who is now a banker, and she wants to introduce him as a new investor. And she tells him that this nice senator who tries to protect separatist do-gooders is just a front. And in fact, she's confiding in him that she's raising money to finance rebellion. And Tay says he's not finding any joy in supporting the Empire either. She says her husband knows nothing about it and is not to be trusted. Smile.
Yeah. Again, very good performance. Performances all around. I also love that in this scene where she talks to Tay, he doesn't know if he can speak with her openly. She doesn't know if she can trust him in this situation. And so there's sort of very high context conversations going on, right? And it's really satisfying where it concludes and you can see, okay, they sort of understand each other, it seems. And it's very interesting. I also feel like there's a lot of unrealized romantic tension, not in this particular scene, but maybe like over the course of their whole relationship. There is a tragic sort of ending to the whole thing, but I feel like in an alternate universe, it could have been something.
It definitely started as a much more authentic relationship from all that Mothma is having with other people. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're at least partially right in that. But then also, let's go into reaping what you saw line from Andor himself. So, what he decides to do next after he got his cut from the robbery is he goes back to Ferrix to pick up his mom, Marva. And not the best choice, but I can understand, especially after the chaos that was in there after trying to capture him and everything.
Yeah.
And so now he says, I finally have this like golden ticket to get out and we can go somewhere warm where we don't have to be in this bog any longer.
Mm-hmm.
And she suddenly says that rebellion is keeping her in there, so she will not go. Andor mocks it, but also he cannot tell her that it was his doing, but his robbery triggered her and she wants to stand up to the oppression too. And so he ends up in a situation where he cannot stay and she cannot go. And I think maybe this is just to me and very unrelated, but I see parallels with Matrix here. Neo doesn't really believe in whatever everyone's saying about the prophecy and him being the chosen one, but he ends up sticking around because he gets to like Morpheus and Trinity, and Morpheus is an avid believer. And the reason why Neo gets stuck into the rest of the two matrices is because he sees the meaning, the gravitation force that this meaning creates for other people. So he's being led to the rebellion by the belief of others, basically. And I think Andor's line is looking how other people see a lot of value in rebellion and gravitating towards, but also by the force of the circumstances around. And we will see a lot of circumstances trying to crush him. Your tactics to just hide under the rock is not going to work anymore. They are going to find you everywhere and they're going to make your life miserable. So I think this is one of those processes where other people put much more value into the rebellion that doesn't mean anything to Andor, but through their eyes, he kind of starts to understand at least the amount of value it can propose, if that makes sense at all.
Interesting. But also, like, he had personal experiences, directly personal experiences that shaped him, that Cyril or Dedra didn't have, our baddies from the Imperial side. If for some reason everyone around Dedra started to praising the rebellion all of a sudden, I'm not sure if that would have been enough for her to convert, because she has all this past lived experiences that sort of formed her convictions in a way. And I feel like, yes, Andor is a survivalist, Andor is a thief. He says that he doesn't care about the rebellion, but he has plenty of reasons to hate them and plenty of reasons to... But yeah, I agree that he's being taught to value it much more, to value the resistance much more. But also, like you mentioned, like, you cannot escape, right? Wherever you go, Empire will get you. And I like how it sort of parallels the idea that for us, for example, it's the capitalist system, right? Capitalism is everywhere. Like, by just the virtue of existing in this life, you engage in this system because everything's profit driven, blah, blah, blah. It's impossible to exist within a society and not partake in it. And the same for Andor when he proposes to Marva to get away to their, I don't know, their version of Florida or whatever. what she's going to do there. For her, there's no connections. She has a community here, apparently, in Ferrix. She knows people. She was a president of their social club. I feel like the implications are very much that she's tied to this place in the way she's tied to these people. And Andor is like, yeah, let's go start anew. But it's not really a possibility. It's not an option, actually. It's an illusion to think that, oh, now that you have lots of money, you're free from what? You're free from the oppression, or you're free from these material conditions that affect everyone.
I think the best metaphor to describe it is if one remembers the scene from Indiana Jones when there's a ceiling with spikes coming slowly to crush you. Maybe the ceiling is not equally leveled, and maybe some parts, some countries, some groups of people are going to experience the spikes earlier than the others.
Right.
But the fact that you don't feel the spikes and somebody else does doesn't mean that you will not be crushed eventually.
Yeah. Sure.
So, back to Dedra. So Dedra is under hit by another colleague for continuing her investigation into this Andor thing.
We have to mention that the Starpath unit that Andor wanted to sell to Luthen was lost during the whole corporate police raid, and it then was found by the ISB when the Empire came in. And the thing is, Dedra suspects that there is like a concentrated empire-wide, galaxy-wide effort to collect this Imperial, various different technology, mostly technology we're talking about.
Yeah. And so we can see her for the first time willing to bend the rules to get what she wants, because she's like a hound. Once she gets the scent of it, she doesn't let go.
She's highly motivated to play this career game there, right?
She goes above and beyond to assemble the data to prove that there is a possible connection between the Starpath unit and the entire hidden rebellious network of agents stealing and using Imperial
property
tools.
Yeah, Imperial tools.
To get what they want. And this way she gets a promotion.
Essentially, yeah. She's like, the resistance, the rebellion, the criminals, they don't care about the arbitrary lines that ISB or that the Empire drew on the map, essentially. They divided all the galaxy into sectors for easier management and whatnot. But people don't care about borders that much.
Right.
That's the thing. If we decide to silo all of these different Imperial teams that are responsible for each individual sector, and there's no cross-communication, and there's no proper, exchange of information and materials and forces, then it becomes a problem. Because if rebels know how we do this thing, they can just countermeasure it, essentially. Which I feel like, okay, let's forget for a second that ISB is like a fascist brand. It's also a good point about management in general and management of teams. This is also something that is very much applicable to game development in a way, where you have all these different departments that are siloed from each other. Like the level designers cannot speak to UI artists, cannot speak to programmers. And there are these huge corporations in the gaming industry that operate in a way that is incredibly inefficient. But on paper, it's a very clean sort of structure. On paper, it should work, but it doesn't because of a human factor, because of the ways that we communicate. And it's not just in the gaming industry, right? It's all types of bureaucracy.
This is, again, the places where your creativity can lead you. If Dedra wasn't that insisting on investigating this whole thing, probably we would not see the rest of season 2.
Oh, yeah. And
a lot of things wouldn't happen.
A lot of things would happen. There's like an amazing butterfly effect from two guys trying to harass some random dude on whatever the planet was called. And then it ends up in the blowing up of the Death Star, essentially. This is amazing. This is beautiful.
Yeah, this is beautiful. And so we cut into Andor for a second here, because Andor has left to a vacation planet, probably Florida, and he's having a great time.
Space Grease.
But he gets arrested being mistook for somebody else, and his trial is like no defense, just the sentence. And what used to be a 6-month sentence for
resisting arrest
to the local police, now he gets 6 years due to this new order that was issued after the Aldhani garrison was robbed.
Exactly. And the irony that he's being detained for nothing that's related to Aldani,
Yeah.
right? He's just a random dude. Yeah.
Wrong place, wrong time.
Wrong place, wrong time, random thing. He gives a fake name and they're like, yep, you're going to prison for 6 years. While preparing for the episode, I was also researching like various different things. And this is obviously like a police overreach kind of thing, right? This is a very contemporary thing for sure. And what's interesting is that I stumbled upon a whole ass Wikipedia article, which is called List of Unarmed African Americans Killed by Law Enforcement Officers in the United States.
Oh my God.
And they're like breakdown by years. And already in 2025, I think it was 6 people were already killed throughout this year, unarmed African Americans due to law enforcement overreach.
Horrible.
Unarmed, most likely innocent, not even most likely, innocent, right? In most of cases. And it's like, what the hell is that? And you see a lot of parallels with what Snamik's saying about like the empire overreach of oppression.
And the fact that you need to use the weapon to keep it sharp.
Exactly.
All right. And so back to the weapon, actually. Dedra gets Cyril from his new job. He got a job in a very boring department thanks to his mother's connections. And Dedra invites him for questioning. And turns out that Cyril is constantly firing false reports on Cassian to still try to get him through his new position in fuel purity sector. So he's definitely not the guy who potentially let it go.
Yeah, he's very determined, very obsessed with this, right? Because I feel like he's putting the blame like solely on Cassian. It's all because of you, right?
He's partially correct.
He is, but again, that's the thing. His superior back in the corporate office said that the guys were harassing somebody they shouldn't have. They were off duty. They were drunk. They were like, come on. He knows what's up with that. And Cyril with his misplaced idealism, right? Similar to Nemik. Nemik is a somewhat naive believer in goodness and the way it's going to all turn out. Later on, we're going to have a whole speech from Cyril to Dedra about also something pure and beautiful and righteous. So he's also a believer, but like in a wrong thing.
Yeah, and I guess as many characters, they are slaves to their desires. The desires that they don't choose, but they decide to act on them. I mean, you have to have imagination for things like this, like filing false reports.
Yeah.
But now, knowing what Cyril knows, Dedra wants to find Andor and get to the one who's behind him.
What's interesting, like during the interviewing, she's like, can you confirm the report that was written by my colleague? And he was like, I don't know what's in there. They never gave me the report to read. I just signed it because they gave me some papers and that's it. Which is also interesting because from the looks of it, the Empire is very strict. You have the button-down uniform, ironed uniforms. Everything is pristine, clean, white and black and gray, and it's like extremely clinical and stuff. But underneath, it's still a humongous, horrible bureaucracy, which has a lot of things.
With superiors covering their asses?
Yeah, people are covering their asses. They're making it look as if everything is fine, but actually structure there works horribly inefficiently.
I like the phrase that Cyril says, can one ever be too aggressive in preserving order?
Oh my God.
But despite his best effort, Dedra doesn't recruit him, even though he desperately wants to, and she tells him to leave her alone. And we are being thrown back to Andor, who is now being transported to a planet with a number of prisons on them. They're like floating prisons, I guess. So they are a part of the dam.
Yeah, they're like octagonal prison islands, essentially, like Alcatraz in space. Yeah, it's like it's a very sort of imposing, impenetrable structure right in the middle of sea.
Andor is having a high voltage introduction to the prison facility where they will be manufacturing things for the Empire for free, and they have 12-hour shift every day. The TV series has a couple of sneak peeks into how Empire economy works. It doesn't go into too much detail because I think, as with the example with gold, combined together, it wouldn't make any sense. But here and there, whatever is being mentioned, Ferrix or Aldani, we see that Empire is trying to use everything as their labor camps. So either to seize resources or to build some cheap manufacturing or to seize the hub of transportation. It kind of has a very strong industrial basis to do all the things, which I love, because you cannot be a very strong and powerful empire without having places to manufacture weapons or train soldiers or do all other wild things. So it's really good that we're being shown how it's working. In this prison, we also have Andy Serkis' character who plays his boss.
He's a shift boss, right?
Yeah.
He's also a prisoner. That's an important thing here.
And he has less than a year left to serve. So obviously he doesn't want any surprises. And turns out that there is a competition in productivity, and the least productive table will be disciplined, aka getting fried on the electricity floor. But the top table gets flavor to their food that is given through tubes.
Oh my god.
And Andor, speaking of consequences to his actions, Andor finds out that because of his heist, and again, nobody knows that he did it, otherwise I think they would kill him.
Yeah.
Because of his heist, everyone's sentence have been doubled.
Yeah. But that's the thing. Like this whole setup from the get-go is unjust, inhumane. This is slave labor, essentially, right? This isn't very far off from the concentration camps in World War II or private prisons in the US nowadays. The sentence has been doubled, but like the whole thing from the get-go is rotten. Yeah, it's not a fun notion to experience that they've been doubled, but like the fact that guys are there in the first place, what requires your rage more than the fact that the sentence has been prolonged in a way. I really like the character of Kino Loy, Andy Serkis' character. He's like this guy who is a prisoner who tries to discipline everyone else to stand in line, be on program, no chit-chats, no rumors, no nothing. Do what we're told, shift after shift, and we're going to be okay.
To be honest, he does make an impression of a good boss. He is strict enough to get things running, but he's not overdoing this.
Sure, I'm looking at this more from a perspective like he's a character who is an embodiment of someone existing within the system, understanding the injustice of the system, but also saying, I'm just going to play by the rules, and I'm going to discipline everyone around me to play by the rules so that we go through this together till the end. And that's it. It's going to end, and we're going to be fine. And I feel like this is a very similar type of delusion that Andor had when he offered Marva to escape to space Spain or whatever. Because there's not going to be a point where this ends and we're fine, and the system doesn't change at the same time.
The ceiling with the spikes.
Ceiling with the spikes, right. And I feel like the end of the prison aspect of this arc also shows this very well. And it shows how Andy Serkis sees that there's not going to be a happy ending at the end of however many shifts that he's going to put in. And we're going to get to this.
Now we're seeing Mothma and her guests at another party discussing Palpatine's reaction to the heist, putting out surveillance and persecution without limit, and a very beautiful dialogue happens in there. So how much protection is enough? We know what too little looks like. If we are doing nothing wrong, what is here to fear? Val and her girlfriend are now waiting for Cass to show up on Ferrix, while no one knows he's in prison and there's basically nobody to help him. Unlike this actual historical character that you talked about, yes, exactly, because as far as I remember, he was pushed to emigrate from Russian Empire to France.
I think he escaped to either France or Germany, and there he was also captured on an unrelated case, not as a robber, and he managed to fake madness for 3 years and managed then to escape his confinement.
That is literally insane.
There's a story in and of itself. There's like a TV show waiting to happen.
But I mentioned him because I remember that he had friends also in immigration who were trying to get him out and even to try to find money to organize a prison break for him, which I believe did not happen. But yeah, so Andor is on his own. This is when Luthen actually goes to Saw Guerrera and pretends like Aldani job wasn't his.
Yeah, so that's the thing. From our perspective, this is like a side quest, right? So this is very much a side plot, and we're shown that Luthen goes to Saw Guerrera. Saw Guerrera is at this point is an established character within the broader canon of Star Wars. I think he was introduced in the animated show Clone Wars or Rebels. I think either of those, and then he was sort of fleshed out in other media. Rogue One, he appears as well. He's played by Forrest Whitaker. And Saw Gerrera has his own sort of band of revolutionaries. They're also like very much resistance fighters. Luthen comes to him with a business proposal. I'm gonna give you such and such tools and stuff, like something valuable, but in return, I don't want money.
I want you to play with other kids nicely.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is basically it. He says that there is an other resistance member called Anto Krieger who plans to make a strike, like an airstrike on, I think it was like a military base near Spellhouse. That's what they call. I don't know where it is exactly. The location is called Spellhouse. The strike is planned. He needs assistance. Luthen asks Saw to come and join and help with there because they have X-wings, they have some weapons, so it's like they're capable. They're also this partisan unit in a way. And it's an absolutely fascinating conversation that they have because Saw doesn't want anything to do with Anto Krieger.
Yeah, he says he works alone, and Luthen says, this is what I'm trying to change.
Exactly. Yeah, and also that's the thing. There's an amazing speech by Forrest Whitaker when he says that Anto Krieger, he's a separatist, and like
Maya Pei's a New Republican, the human cultists, the galaxy petitionists, all of them lost.
And like, this is amazing. He's the only guy who knows what to do, and everyone else is like a huge asshole. He might be right, but that's the thing. He then asks Luthen, but I don't know, who are you exactly, actually? And yeah, Luthen has his own sort of response that he's just a guy who wants this whole thing to end. But it's very interesting how this is the perfect image of like a leftist infighting.
That is true, because this is a historically accurate curse that the left movement has always had inside. Lefts can very often predict what's going to happen. They have a very specific position of how to achieve their goal. And if this perspective does not fit with everyone else, then there's a split. It's very hard for lefts to play along nicely with each other when they know that in X years we're going to split anyway, so let's split right now.
It's almost a curse of foresight.
Exactly, yes.
But that's the thing, people are speculating a lot of the times. We don't know for sure how things are going to go. But it was also very interesting to hear. Basically, Forrest Whitaker's character, Saw Gerrera, might as well have said that you have
Trotskyists, Bolsheviks, anarchists, all of them lost.
You know, like, it would have been the same, right? Ultimately.
It was pretty close to that because, yeah, he's criticizing literally everyone. Everyone is not good enough for him, and he uses it as an excuse to be a jerk and not cooperate with others.
But also, it's interesting, Luthen calls him out, and he says that anarchy is a luxury to a man in your position, right? So he specifically calls out Saw Gerrera as an anarchist. It's one of the rare occasions where this show goes into a real thing, right? I also find it quite true in terms of historical depiction. You have, again, I'm going to reference the October Revolution and how anarchist groups helped out there a lot of times, but there were also tensions in a way that there were criticisms of how anarchist groups cannot maintain like a proper organization for the proletariat so that they could actually go somewhere after all the operations and all the raids and expropriations and all of that. And I feel like in Saw's case, if I may go a little bit further story-wise, we see him in season 2 and especially in Rogue One ending up being just a guy who annoys the Empire with all these raids and like small-scale military operations without actually proposing any particular path. Why should people follow him? Yeah, he is charismatic, he's intimidating, he has presence, but he's also just
He doesn't have any economical program.
he's very much against the Empire. But what he is pro is sort of left ambiguous in the show and ultimately unresolved in a way that I feel like is satisfying because it shows that, yeah, he is a very real sort of archetype of a resistance
Right.
member that can end up like this.
And so Luthen tells him that he wants Empire to strike hard because oppression breeds rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious to do a bit of a reading of what theories do we have emerging about this? What makes people go into rebellion?
Mm-hmm.
And I found some things that I did not know before this podcast happened. For example, there is a theory of everyday rebellion. So there was I think, American political scientist, James Scott, who was researching peasants' rebellions across centuries. And at some point, he realized that he might miss the point. And what became more important to him is understanding that the everyday ways the peasants resist, the small ongoing struggles against those who demand their labor, food, taxes, rent, or debt payments, these forms of resistance usually don't involve open or organized revolt.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, they rely on subtle tactics used by people with little power, so dragging their feet, pretending to obey, playing dumb, stealing small amounts, spreading rumors, setting fires, or just quietly sabotaging things.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of this we actually see throughout different storylines of Andor. And these methods share a few traits, so they don't need planning or teamwork, they're pretty accessible, they're often done alone, they avoid directly confronting the authorities or challenging social norms. And still, just like with the rebellions, we shouldn't romanticize these weapons of the weak because they rarely bring major change to the exploitation of peasants. But they're also not meaningless either because they're clever and they're quiet acts of resistance that still matter. Then I also found the Gur theory. Putting it in simple terms, people have expectation of what they deserve to have, and then they also have reality. And when they compare and the difference is too vast, this is something that brings them on the edge to do something about this. The probability that the aggression is going to happen when people feel deprived is the biggest against the government or social institutions.
Right.
Then there's also the Davis J-curve of critical timing. I think it kind of lies along with the Gore theory. He says that revolution is likely when, after a long period of rising expectations, accompanied by a parallel increase in dissatisfaction, a downturn occurs. And this perception of lost satisfaction due to expectations that still continue to rise creates this widening gap of dissatisfaction that can lead to violence.
But this can take a lot of time.
I personally think that these theories can be partially true, but also they are somewhat flimsy. Because what I think is very down to earth is that revolution occurs when we have productive forces that outgrow the relationships of production, when we have enough power and we have enough tools to make life better for more people objectively. But people who have their niches in the current relationships are very much unequal, and there are a lot of people interested in keeping them unequal because this way they can get a bigger pie to themselves. They are going to try and do everything they can to preserve this type of relationships, even though these relationships are not fitting with the new production methods that we're having.
I think NFTs is a great example of this. You're trying to apply the rules of physical scarcity onto digital data that doesn't have a concept of scarcity.
Right.
Like, you can copy and paste JPEGs freely without any issue, without loss of data. You have a single JPEG, you might as well have, 10 terabytes of the same JPEG. But if you have a single potato, yes, you can, plant it and et cetera, but it's not, we don't have a replicator from Star Trek yet. And so NFT is the way to say, oh no, actually this particular JPEG is unique, and it's like this unique potato, and it's only like a single unit of it, or whatever, which is ludicrous, right? It doesn't make sense from the material standpoint. And that's why, yeah, if we have similar things in society, way back when wars were fought over spices, over pepper and paprika and whatever the fuck. Nowadays, they're just standing freely available in every restaurant, in every household, on the table. They cost very little to obtain, at least in the majority of countries.
Monarchs were also very interested in keeping things the way they were in feudalism, but
Exactly.
they had much more productive means to feed more people and become more educated. And this is
Exactly.
how bourgeoisie captured the flag.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it wasn't within a really good fight. Throughout the years, it wasn't just one battle to be won, it had to be continuously won.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And how do we define revolution in this discussion? This is pretty late to bring this up, but better late than never.
To me, revolution is a qualitative change in how society is being ordered,
Right.
how society is being organized. It has a distinction to the coup, when it's just, you don't really change how we distribute food or how we produce it or how we have monetary relationships. You just change horses on the merry-go-round.
You don't change the fundamental material relationships.
Yeah, you
that
just
we have.
change the facade and that's it.
Exactly. The reason that I'm bringing this up is also because in season 2, there's going to be a great sort of illustrations to the distinction between a revolution and a coup, in a way. But also looking at Andor and looking at their struggle, and you mentioned them showing that Empire, from the economical standpoint, has production, and we're shown that they need to have some material basis for their production, which is
Right.
great. What is not great from my perspective is that we're not actually shown like what the revolution is going to bring in terms of change of these fundamental relationships. Ideally, of course, we blow up the Death Star, rebels win, and we don't have slaves to build super weapons. Cool. Do we still have trade? Do we still have bosses and employees? Do we still have
Who
poverty?
owns the factories that the Empire has built?
Exactly. Who owns the factories? How do we organize our society in the
Who
galaxy?
decides what costs what?
And I'm saying this not to say that, oh, it's better to have a Palpatine at the top to decide all the things. No. It's not about that. It's about, yeah, we need to get rid of the Palpatine, but then what? Like, what is the plan? How are we going to organize this? And it's not a gotcha question. It's a genuine question. Like, for these people, for Nemeks, Andors, and Luthens of the world, like, what comes next? And I think, like, a huge missed opportunity for Star Wars is that we weren't actually shown that stuff changed much, to be honest. And in fact, the sequel trilogy then absolutely negates any notion of change, because
Yeah.
they're going to have the First Order, they're going to have their own fascist government afterward, blah, blah, blah. Maybe in a way, it's actually a good illustration that if you don't change any material conditions,
Then it replicates itself.
that it replicates itself, which is fine. But I also don't think that this is what they were going for.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. But yeah, we sort of steered away. I feel like it's a really nice way to cover this topic, right? What is the resistance? Why do people resist, and how they resist? What I love about Andor is a TV show that we have all these almost extras, these background characters, or one scene, couple of scene characters that leave their impact on this whole journey, the rebellion of the resistance. They're just normal people like Brasso, or the guy that had the hounds.
Brasso is so nice.
Brasso is a bro.
Yeah, he's such a nice guy.
He's a good man, and it's great that they show sort of his circling back to the resistance, right? And the like small acts of resistance at the end of episode 3 in the first arc. We're sort of shown that he ties the ship that the corporate police arrived in to some debris and stuff, and when they try to leave, it becomes overweight, and then they crash and stuff. So it was a hostile act towards the corporate police, but he was very stealthy about it. He just came out. He was not involved in Andor stuff. He was not involved in Luthen and resistance stuff, but he sees like, hey, he can help, right? Because this might be about them trying to catch Andor. So yeah, going back to Saw Guerrera and side quest, this was all. This whole part of the conversation, I think, was just spun up out of that, the ways that people resist. And like Saw is an anarchist. He's very militant also. He's very moody also. He changes his mind later on about his stance on helping or not Anto Krieger. But Luthen is like a guy who tries to make this thing work, and he doesn't really care about the super specifics. For Andor, back in episode 3, like separatists, New Republicans, all these people, they were all the same, in parentheses, in a negative way. Whereas to Luthen, they're all the same in a positive way. Yeah, okay, whatever. We're here to reach the same goal. I need to manage it. We all need to manage it to make it all work in the end. We need to see Empire down, and then we'll figure out,
Yeah, that's a smart way to go about it. Something to end this part of the conversation on is there's this vibe of dormant hostility while Luthen and Saw talk to each other.
Passive aggressiveness, right?
It's kind of, there's pressure in the conversation, and because of Saw's moodiness also and his mood swings, you don't know whether he's going to jump you right now and backstab you, declaring you ISB dog or whatever. It's very hard to live like this when your ideological friends, quote unquote, are also like this. You cannot trust them.
Yeah.
You cannot confide in them. You don't know what they're planning. You don't know whether you can trust what they're saying.
But not unbased, I would say, because Luthen lies. Like, obviously, he needs to maintain secrecy, and he lies about being involved with Aldani. He's like, was it your job? It was great. And so I was like, no, it wasn't me. Maybe it was you. And Luthen's like, yeah, I would never. And stuff like that. And I like how over both seasons we sort of see how this secrecy and paranoia makes Saw devolve into this, essentially into this maniac. The guy who doesn't trust anyone. He's a paranoid maniac who's like, there's spies everywhere, everyone's lying to me.
And it is to a bigger extent true, because it's a risk to confide in anyone. And we didn't even touch the question of being seduced by the money and by the things that Empire can offer you, which is a big thing, because the closer you get to the Empire's core, the bigger the benefits are, and how money can twist your mind as well.
This will be reflected also in the series, I think, in season 2, right? In the Mon Mothma storyline.
Yeah.
Is going to be the case. Yeah, for sure. So it's like you have this, you have the ideological differences, there's paranoia all around. Lost. And like, what do you do with this? This is awful. It's very difficult to exist in.
Yeah. So let's continue in another part.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting our project on Patreon at patreon.com/BORZOIcast, where you can enjoy ad-free episodes and bonus content. That's patreon.com/BORZOIcast.